Welcome to the 2022 Hicks Lecture, sponsored by Oxford Economic Papers and organized here in the Economics Department here in Oxford. It is named after Sir John Hicks, of course, the famous economist who spent 38 years of his academic life here at Oxford. The lecture is, has been taking place since 1984, not every year, but that is also 38 years ago that it started. We've had, over the years, fabulous economists talking about all kinds of topics, and we've had here, and let me very quickly give the surname: Solo, Calder, Modigliani, Dornbusch, Krugman, Heckman, Becker, Lucas, Tirol, Sen, Diet, Schelling, Blanchard, Rogoff, Duflo, Besley, Finkelstein, and many more. It actually means it's quite appropriate to have this year's lecture delivered by Daron Acemoglu. Daron is, well, doesn't need much introduction. He's Institute Professor at the Department of Economics at MIT, where he's been since 1993. And he has such a diverse portfolio of research and makes a lot of impact in all kinds of areas, both in thinking and in terms of policy side. And today he'll be talking about technological change under the title Redirecting Technological Change, Applications to Energy, Automation and AI. The format of the lecture is essentially, Daron will talk for about an hour, maybe just under an hour, and then we'll have half an hour of questions. We have an audience in the room. We also have, of course, close to 150 people online already that will be able to put in the Q&A questions, put it in the Q&A function. During the Q&A, I think I will read out the questions that are posted, and I will also, of course, give the room the chance to give some questions here for further discussion. So without further ado, Daron, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks for inviting me, Stefan and James. And thank you to all of you for joining us. It's a true pleasure to be delivering the Hicks Lecture, albeit remotely. So I'm going to talk about redirecting technological change, applications to energy, automation, and AI. And it's actually, in my humble opinion, it's a good topic for me to talk about because it does bring two of the areas that I have been passionate about over the last 25 or so years, political economy and technology, but hopefully with a number of new ideas for at least most of you in the audience. It is also overlapping with a new book that I'm working on, which will be out spring 2023. Not on the same topic, but with an overlapping set of issues. So for some of you, there might be more reading on this coming soon if you are indeed interested beyond the academic articles. So what is the main theme? The main theme here summarized in this first slide, which I'm going to substantiate and build on in the rest of this hour, and then take questions, is that technology is much more malleable than economists typically assume. So there isn't a particularly preordained path of technology. It's not only that we don't know what types of innovations are going to come, that's already, of course, part of the thinking of most people, but the direction of technology, which types of techniques, which type of organizations we develop. There are many directions, many paradigms that are possible, and several of these have very distinct implications, not just for the productivity, but about the distribution of resources. For example, who benefits, who loses, whose political and social power is exacerbated, and who is marginalized. And of course, those are particularly visible in areas like climate. I will also argue productivity and work, but also about the interaction between these technologies and political structures, such as democracy. Moreover, I'm going to argue that there is neither a simple market process that will automatically select whichever path is better, even if we could define what a better path is, nor is there any other market or social process that generates that different paths are going to have benefits that trickle down to everybody. So the distribution of gains that are embedded in some of those paths have permanent implications that could be quite important. There are conditions under which we'll talk about, institutions and norms, and as well as market incentives might generate strong tendencies for better paths or for experimentation across paths. But in a number of critical areas today, energy, general production technologies, and AI, I'm going to argue that the global economy has not done that type of experimentation. So there is a need for redirecting technological change. And hence, the last part of the lecture will be about how to redirect technological change. So here's the plan of the lecture. I'll talk briefly about the need to redirect technology and energy, briefly because that's obvious. The bigger part, which I think is more original, and so I'll spend about 20 minutes or so, is what's wrong with the current production technologies. So in this process, I'm going to provide a new way of thinking of production technologies, which really highlights that different ways of advancing the technological frontier will indeed have very different consequences in terms of who benefits, who loses, what we do in terms of work or nature of work and wages and inequality. And then I have a lot to say about AI, but given that time is short, I'll probably rush a little bit on this part, though I have a lot of slides on this. So we'll see how much of this I cover, but I'll explain why there are various different ways in which AI technologies can be used. But again, we have made systematically wrong choices on how we use AI today and going more into it. Then I'll briefly talk about a general framework about how direction of technology is determined, emphasizing the role of economic and social factors. I'll provide some evidence from the energy sector, and then discuss briefly how to redirect technology using some of these lessons from the energy sector, and then I'll conclude. All right, on energy, I don't think I need to amplify this point any further. There has been a huge buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The amount of greenhouse gases does fluctuate naturally and has done so over the last thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. But today, the amount is more than 2 standard deviation beyond the mean, and has already led to an enormous amount of climate change. The general consensus is, of course, quite clearly, almost really beyond doubt, is that this is because of industrial production that has relied on fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. But it's not really a natural resource problem. It's really a technology problem. The reason why fossil fuels are consumed is because we invested in technologies that use fossil fuels. And in fact, these technologies have advanced a lot, much more than their energy efficiency. So as a result, the amount of energy we produce has increased together with fossil fuel consumption. And I'll come back at the end and talk about alternative ways of organizing the energy sector. And those are relevant for thinking about why there was a particular direction of technology, how it has changed somewhat over the last 30 years, and what else can be done. In terms of current production, I want to do a soft introduction to this topic, because I think this is one where there's a lot of new material here that I want to share with you, of course, in a summary form. But many of you will be familiar with the Kaldor facts of balanced growth, which were never really exactly true, but were sort of a good approximation to the growth process of Western nations over many decades in the West. And what we have seen in many industrialized nations, not least in the United States, is a very sharp decline in the labor share going against one of those Kaldor facts. So here I'm showing you the aggregate labor share in the US in the private business sector. It's gone down from around 68 to just over 60%. And if you do industry adjustment in the red, again, you have almost a 10 percentage point decline, which is really unheard of in the UK, US, or other advanced economies. Stefan, do you have a question, please?
No. This is more to people giving already questions. Sorry.
Oh, okay. I saw the hand up. So, okay. So there are many reasons why the capital share or the labor share in national income could be moving around, markups, monopsony, capital deepening. But there's growing evidence, which I'm going to share with you, that this is because of changes in what I'm going to call the task content driven by automation, especially what I'm going to call excessive automation. And that's going to be the main idea about general production technologies excessively going in the automation direction. So there are many new ideas here packed into this one slide. That's why I'm going to spend about 20 minutes or so sort of unpacking them. But before I do that, let me say that the labor share is not something that we should ignore and not care about, precisely because many other labor market objects that are even more important, such as inequality, move hand in hand with the labor share. So during the periods in which labor share has been declining, you have also witnessed very large increases in inequality in the US. So here I'm showing you the evolution of real wages for men and women of 5 education groups, going all the way down from high school dropouts in red to workers with postgraduate degrees in dark blue. And what you see in the 60s, and the same is true in the 50s if you go back with different data sources, is that growth was broadly shared, that the real earnings of all 10 of these demographic groups were growing more or less in tandem and more or less at the same rate as productivity growth, about 2% a year in real terms. But from the around 1980s, you see a huge increase in inequality, both among women and men, and even more strikingly, among men, low and middle education groups, workers with some college, high school graduates, and high school dropouts experienced significant declines in their real earnings. Even workers with just a college degree, now postgraduate degree, the light blue, you see that they haven't really benefited all that much from the growth process of the last several decades. These are in some ways idiosyncratic US facts, but the increase in inequality is not just a US phenomenon. By using an omnibus measure of labor market inequality, such as the Gini coefficient, the Peterson Institute and the OECD estimate that inequality has increased pretty much in every OECD economy. But even more interestingly, there are very common changes in the occupational structure or the social structure of these economies, as witnessed by this figure, which plots changes in the occupation shares of different types of jobs in the major economies of the OECD. In red, what I'm showing here is the change in the employment share of middle class occupations, those in the middle tercile of the wage distribution, and those are dominated by blue collar occupations and clerical and sales related occupations in offices. And you see that in pretty much every country in the OECD, those middle class jobs have been in retreat. And what's relevant about those jobs is, first of all, they are the bedrock of the middle class, where there's a lot of upward mobility, middle class economic security, and so on. But also those are the jobs that are that have been at the crosshairs of automation. So specialized software-based automation in offices, accounting software, inventory control, word processing, and especially databases have been very important for automation of office work. And robotics, dedicated machinery, numerically controlled machinery have been very important for the blue-collar occupations. So those trends, together with this type of automation-related facts, motivate what I'm going to present in the next few slides. So I'm going to argue that there is, of course, nothing new about automation. And in all current and previous episodes of automation, going to the horse-powered reapers, harvesters, threshing machines in starting in the 19th century, machine tools, industrial robotics, and now software and even AI, what you have is a process of technological change that ill fits into the usual way that the standard textbook economic model conceptualizes technology. So the way that most economists start thinking about technology is to either specify an aggregate production function of this form or some sectoral production functions of this form, where you use capital and labor, and technology comes in the form of these AL/AK terms, which are factor augmenting. They make either labor or capital more productive. And especially if you want to be in line with the Kaldor facts, according to the Uzawa theorem, you would actually put a lot of emphasis on this AL. Labor becomes more and more productive. It turns out that this really is ill-fitting for many of these technologies that I have emphasized, which are, not the only types of technologies. I will emphasize the malleability and the diversity of new techniques and new organizations, but these have been an important part of technological change. And really, it's very hard to make sense of. Why? If you think of what each one of these is doing, is that it's replacing some tasks that were previously performed by labor. And you cannot think of that either as making labor more productive. And in fact, I'm going to explain why you cannot even think of it as making capital more productive. You have to think of it somewhat differently. And this is not just a sort of epistemological issue of how we conceptualize technology. It has actually critical implications about the implications of technology, what it implies for wages, for work, and for inequality. So let me unpack all of these by first providing an alternative framework for thinking about production, and then contrasting this framework, which is, of course, geared towards making sense of these types of technologies, to the usual way of thinking about technology. So to do that, I'm going to specify production as consisting of tasks. So think of tasks as the units of the production process. So if you are going to produce a piece of garment, you need to perform many of the sub-units of production, and each one of them is critical for that process. So you need to design something, you need to produce yarn by spinning, and then you need to weave and put that together, stitching and weaving. You need to go through a variety of other production processes related to coloring, chemical processes, drying, and so on. And then finally, you have a huge range of non-production tasks: accounting, inventory control, transport, wholesale, retail, marketing. And it's only when all of these tasks are completed that a piece of garment can actually reach its target. So I'm going to capture that by saying output, let's say in a sector, but for now, imagine a one sector economy. I'll come back to multiple sectors in a second, at least in verbal terms. And you need to perform these tasks, and YZ is the amount of task performance or task services of task Z. And then I'm normalizing these tasks, and show you in a second graphically as well, to lie between n-1 and n. That's just a normalization. So they are they integrate to 1. And then you combine them according to some aggregator that gives you the output. And I've taken that aggregator to be a constant elasticity of substitution, one that doesn't actually matter all that much, but with sigma is the elasticity of substitution. The key is that these tasks need to be allocated to different factors of production. So for instance, take a weaving task. Are you going to perform that using a skilled weaver, an unskilled weaver, or a machine like a weaving machine, which is what, the power looms that really drove people mad in the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, because artisans felt that they were being thrown away from their jobs. So mathematically, YZ is automatable for some tasks, those between the bottom and some threshold I, and has not been technologically automated for the remaining tasks. If you're not technologically automated, then you can only be produced by labor. Here I have removed the distinction between skilled and unskilled labor. I'll come back to that in a second. And then that labor is going to have some productivity, gamma LZ, and I'm going to allow a general productivity booster for labor to mimic this thing here, the old way of thinking or the classic way of thinking about technology. But if a task is technologically automated, then you have a choice between doing it with labor or capital. And capital itself has a productivity gamma KZ, and then also is also multiplied by AK. Now, using this framework, I'm going to show you how graphically you can envisage this and in fact do some of the analysis. And so to do that, let's consider this graphic. So on the horizontal axis, I have the task at hand, and the vertical axis is the cost of production. And I'm plotting two curves. This one here is the cost of producing a task with labor. So that's the cost of a unit task is the wage that you have to pay to labor divided by the productivity of labor, which was AL over gamma Ls. Or you can produce it with capital, but you can only do that for tasks that are technologically automated, those to the left of this threshold I. And that cost is going to be the cost of capital R divided by the productivity of capital AK times gamma K. The firm's problem is nothing other than choosing the lower envelope in the assignment of tasks to factors. So to do that in particular, I'm going to just trace the lower envelope here. Well, that means you assign all of these tasks to capital, but then you have to stop because those tasks cannot be assigned to capital, and then you have a jump up, and then you follow this. So that's a simple problem, but I want to next highlight what technological change does in this framework. So let's start with the classic examples or the standard examples of technological change. So what does an increase in AL do? Well, you can see that in this framework, an increase in AL is a uniform rise in the productivity of labor in all tasks. Now you see two problems with this, or you may see two problems. One is that it's very unrealistic. There are no examples of technologies, certainly none of the ones that I gave you in the previous slide, but going more broadly, there are no examples of productivity, the technologies that increase the productivity of labor in all tasks. Even something very general like electrification would increase the productivity of labor only in a subset of tasks. The second thing is that you see that when you do something like AL, you generate a huge increase in productivity. So the cost of everything declines as a result of that. So, if indeed technology did take this labor augmenting form, technology would be a big gift to humanity, as for instance, Freeman Dyson has said, technology is the gift of God. Well, we'll see whether it is or not. But this conceptualization suggests it is. Now, if you look at an increase in AK, it's similar. It reduces the cost of producing all of these tasks with capital. But none of this really is a good descriptive fit to what automation technologies do. So what does numerically controlled machinery do, or what does the spinning machines did? What did the spinning machines do? They took away some of the tasks, such as spinning or such as stitching things together, away from the workers that used to perform them. So in this context, that would correspond to a shift of this vertical line from I to I prime, which I'm showing in this figure. Now you see two very different things that were absent, and those are going to be both critical for my discussion. One, that now there is a direct displacement. Technology directly takes away some tasks from labor, gives them to capital or enables capital to be substituted for them. And as a result, workers are thrown away from these tasks. They may get employment in other tasks, but we'll see what the implications of this are. Second, the productivity effects are actually much more minor. Instead of a big rectangle here or rectangular object here, now it's given like something like a triangle. And in fact, if I make the orange line close to the blue line, I can make that triangle very small. So while this way of thinking about technology is all about productivity, in fact, the way I have drawn it purposefully is that there is no reallocation of tasks here. Whereas here, this is really all about reallocation and with small productivity implications. And then the final thing I want to point out is that you can also add new tasks here. So new tasks are the opposite of reallocation away from labor to capital, because now they're creating things for, I'm focusing on labor intensive tasks, so they're creating new jobs for humans. So they are reinstating workers into the production process. Okay, so now let me draw some of the implications of this framework. So to do that, and this is, I promised, last figure that has, well, last slide that has any math. You can solve this model and aggregate it up. And you will see that when you aggregate it up, output can again be expressed as a function of labor and capital, as in the standard model. And in fact, it takes this form here. And if you look at it, it will have some similarity to this AK times K, AL times L production function, but with a crucial difference. There are also these orange objects which capture the task allocation. And in particular, if you want to look at the implications, and I'll do that by focusing on the labor share, you can write the labor share now as consisting of blue terms. Those are the classic ones that exist in the standard model. W, the wage relative to the productivity of labor, the cost of capital relative to the productivity of capital. But then there is this orange term, which is that the task composition is shifting away from labor to capital and such things. And I will argue in a second that it's really indeed the orange terms that are both empirically very relevant and also quantitatively very relevant. And one way of seeing that is, if the sigma here, the elasticity of substitution, is approximately 1, the blue terms are completely gone. So they won't even impact the share of labor. So everything's going to be driven by this orange term. And the orange term here looks very complicated, but it's approximately n minus I. So it's really how much we are shifting tasks in favor of labor by introducing new labor-intensive tasks versus how much we are taking away from labor with automation. All right. So why did I put so much emphasis on the labor share? First of all, because it links to the Kaldor fact and shows some major changes in the labor market. But secondly, if you want to think about labor demand overall, labor share plays a crucial role, because you can write the wage bill, what employers pay to labor, as output divided output times labor share. And based on that, you can look at what, okay, I had lied. I had this one more equation, but actually I'm not going to focus on the mathematical objects here. I'm just going to focus on the labels. But if you want to look at what happens to the wage bill when you create when you undertake new automation technologies, it really boils down to what it does to output and what it does to labor share. And it's very simple. It always increases output as long as we are in competitive markets without any distortions. Why? Because you would only adopt the automation technology if it reduces costs, and a cost reduction is the same as a productivity increase. But it also creates this displacement effect. The displacement effect is exactly this thing here. Workers are being displaced. And the displacement effect always reduces the labor share. That's where this orange term comes in. This gamma is decreasing in I, as this simple expression here shows. And so you're always going to have a displacement effect that goes against labor. Now, two implications. First, much more robustly than in the classic standard theory of production, now we see technology of one broad sort, these automation technologies, always reduce the labor share independent of what the value of the elasticity of substitution is or other issues. And secondly, the impact on labor is never unambiguous. There is a belief in economics, which we can trace its both theoretical and historical foundations, but I don't have the time to do that. If some people are interested, we can do that in Q&A. But you can think of it as like a productivity bandwagon. Increase productivity, and ultimately it's going to trickle down to labor. And automation technologies, even in competitive markets, and this is going to be amplified in non-competitive markets in a second, as I'll explain, but even in competitive markets, imply that's not necessarily the case. Technological improvement do create a productivity effect that helps labor because it increases labor demand, but it also creates a displacement effect. And the displacement effect can easily be larger than the productivity effect. And in fact, for a class of technologies which Pasquale Restrepo and I, in our work which develops this framework, we call so-so technologies, productivity implications are not great. So when you replace cashiers with automatic self-checkout kiosks, there's some gain in productivity, some reduction in cost, but it's not major. So in those cases, the displacement effect is going to overwhelm the productivity effect. Modest productivity growth going hand in hand with labor market negative implications only. New tasks do the opposite. They create a positive productivity effect, just like automation. In fact, this productivity effect could be much larger because you're creating new things. How much productivity do you get by putting a checkout kiosk versus by creating something that did not exist, like new design jobs or new engineering tasks? That could be much more major. But also it helps labor by generating a reinstatement effect because you're putting workers back into the production process. So to understand this, I want to now show a couple of graphs and a couple of pieces of evidence to build the case. So this is how labor share has evolved in the US from the 1940s to the 1980s, early 1980s or mid 1980s. And you see that the labor share is actually fairly constant within broad sectors. There's some fluctuations, but it's fairly constant. But if you look at the last 30 years when the labor share declines start happening, then you also see that a lot of it is actually within manufacturing. There is some in mining. Well, actually, there's a lot in mining, but mining is a smaller sector. But there's some in services, but really the most important part in manufacturing. And why is that? Well, that's precisely because you see that's exactly where you experience the automation technologies. And this is, I want to show, I'm not going to dwell on this in detail, but using a variety of different measures of automation technologies. So here I'm using the robots adoptions, and here other automation technologies in detailed manufacturing industries. In all cases, you see that adoption of automation technologies is indeed strongly related to the declines in the labor share. In contrast, if you look at other types of technologies, especially those that are critical for labor, for example, introducing new occupations or the emergent skills that have been identified, like new job titles, those tend to increase productivity, but are also associated with labor share increases. So this is already sort of building this notion that different technologies have different implications for labor, different implications for the distribution of resources, and I'll come back to that in the context of inequality in a second. But this is all at a correlational level. So let me take 2 minutes to delve deeper into one of these technologies, robotics. So on the basis of my work with Pasquale Restrepo, what I'm going to present now is a very brief a very brief overview of what happens to labor and, in a second, inequality when you adopt these new technologies such as industrial robotics that are very much targeted at automation. And as a background, industrial robots are not everywhere. They're only in subset of manufacturing. But for that subset of manufacturing, they have been transformational. They have been associated with very large increases in productivity. So if you believe in something like the productivity bandwagon, that it's going to help labor, then you should see that as firms introduce robotics, they should also increase their labor demand. They should create new jobs or some such thing. So to do that, we'll look at different local areas in the United States, 722 commuting zones, their exposure to robots as a function of how much penetration of robotics there is in a particular industry at the frontier technologically, and how important that industry is in a given local area. And here are the results. So what you see, actually the lights have gone off here. 1 second, I'm just going to turn on the lights. This means I'm not moving my hands as much as I should because the sensor thinks I'm not here. So if you look at more exposure to robots, where robots have been adopted more often, you see not higher but lower employment. This is showcased by the industrial heartland of the United States, like Detroit, Lansing, Defiance City, etc. But it's not confined to it. So if you cut those highest robotics areas, you end up with the dashed line instead of the solid line. Even more importantly, perhaps, it's not just employment. It's not that some, welders are losing their jobs. Wages in that area is very severely depressed for the next 20 years. So this is the change in log hourly wages after controls are included, but without controls, it's similar. And if you look at what's driving this, is exactly what you would expect. Is people who used to work in tasks such as operators, assemblers, inspectors, welders, they are losing their jobs. They are losing their jobs in routine manual occupations and these specific occupation categories. So this very much already suggests that, we cannot ignore the distributional effects of some of these technological advances. And contrary to the most optimistic read that new technology somehow will always trickle down in terms of benefits to most workers, you see general depression of the labor market. But this is really the tip of the iceberg. Robotics is only one part of the automation technologies, and the bigger effects of automation are distributional. To do this, in a subsequent paper, Pasquale Restrepo and I, we construct a measure of task displacement, which is essentially, well, let's not look at the mathematical thing, let me just explain it in words, is whether a demographic group, where demographic group is defined by education, gender, age, and ethnicity, whether a demographic group specializes in automatable tasks, such as routine manual tasks that I showed you in a second, in industries that are undergoing automation. So if you are a worker with a male worker with a postgraduate degree in your 30s, you're typically specialized in tasks that have not been automated. And the same is actually true if you are a high school dropout immigrant. You tend to work in very manual, low wage skill, sort of service skill workers, unskilled service work, which is also not being automated. So, but if you look at other demographic groups, for example, older male high school graduates, they tend to work in many of these welding type jobs that have been automated very fast. So here is a summary of what I want to show there. Each circle here is a demographic group. And this is the amount of task displacement they have experienced from 1980 to 2016, according to this measure that I constructed. And here is the change in their hourly wages. And what you see, and the color coding helps you recognize which group is what, that there is a very strong association between task displacement and the changes in the US wage structure. So about 60 to 70% of the changes in the US wage structure is explained by the fact that some groups predominantly used to specialize in tasks that have since been automated. And here I'm showing you that these groups were not on differential trends. In fact, as I showed you already, 50s, 60s, early 70s were a period of shared prosperity. They were growing more or less in tandem with the less automation exposed groups. And that's why the relationship between hourly wage changes between 1950 and 80 and task displacement after 1980 is completely flat before 1980. So, okay, this was a whirlwind tour of saying, well, there's a different way of thinking about production. And it is richer in terms of what it implies about the consequences of new technologies. And it brings out these distributional consequences of new technology. But the question then is, well, if automation is so inequality generating and so important for, making gains from productivity not shared between capital and labor, how come we had several decades of much more shared prosperity? So to do that, in a different paper with Pasquale Restrepo, we try to decompose what the different types of technologies were ongoing in the US. So we don't find much of a role for these capital augmenting and labor augmenting technologies, but two types of technologies are critical. Those that create displacement, automation, and those that create new tasks, the reinstatement. And if you look at the period, between 1947 and 1987, what you see is that there's a lot of displacement generated by automation, but it is almost perfectly counterbalanced by reinstatement. And that's why the labor share is constant, and that's why growth is broadly shared. The same is true, by the way, in manufacturing as well. Very rapid automation, because there are a lot of machine tools and numerically controlled machinery being introduced already in the 50s and the 60s, but it is counterbalanced with a lot of reinstatement. But then fast forward to the more recent 3.5 decades or 3 decades or so, and you see that automation accelerates and reinstatement slows down. In manufacturing, for example, you have about twice as fast displacement and automation as you did in the decades of the 60s and the 50s, and almost no reinstatement. So put differently, therefore, the decline in the labor share and the inequality implications may be, at least in theory, be related to the fact that the technology portfolio of the US and many other countries around the world, when you look at it from an international perspective, has become much less balanced and much more biased towards automation. But you might say, well, if that's the technology that the gods of techniques give us, perhaps there's nothing to do. But I'm going to argue against that because, of course, redirecting technological change is predicated on the endogeneity of technology. And in particular, there is no need for the direction of technology to be efficient or even technology adoption to be efficient. And so here I want to plant the idea of excessive automation. In particular, automation is excessive when it goes beyond what's efficient. And it also creates significant externalities that are not internalized. The significant externalities that are not internalized, I'll come back to them, especially in the context of climate, but they are present in other contexts as well. But let me try to explain why you would have technological change going in the automation direction beyond what's efficient. So here is one easy scenario. If this curve here is the opportunity cost of labor, but because of bargaining or rents, firms perceive the labor cost or the wage that they face is actually above that, then automation is going to be comparing this curve here to the orange one. A social planner that's utilitarian would like to stop here at this point, where the solid blue curve intersects the orange curve. But firms would want to go all the way to the maximum. In fact, they would go all the way to here. Now, this is an example of excessive automation in 2 ways. First of all, you're deviating from what the social planner would like to do. But second, as a result of that, you're creating this red area, and red area is negative productivity. So if you have here the productivity effect that's given by the green triangle, but then the red triangle subtracts from that because you are actually automating tasks and using tasks with capital that's socially more expensive than the social cost of labor. So you're really not going to get much productivity benefits from automation, but you're going to have all of the negatives in terms of labor inequality and so on. All right. So now let me do a small course correction and talk a little bit about AI, because I've taken more on the production technology side as I feared I might. But we have covered a lot of ground. So I want to argue, and I'm going to do this more quickly, so without going into the sort of the framework, the mathematical framework and the evidence as much, but I want to argue that despite claims to the contrary, AI, which is promised to bring all sorts of goods, is actually an unusually centralized technology dominated by a few firms and a very monolithic vision of how you're going to monetize AI. And as a result, it is actually not generating as much productivity gains as one might have hoped. And it's empowering large corporations with a variety of negative economic, social, and political implications. To do that, one has to look at the specific ways in which AI is used, and there are many. And since time is short, I want to just focus on 3 of those. Actually, 4 of those, but very briefly. And then I have a couple more in my slides, but I'm going to skip those. One is about AI and data collection. Data is the lifeblood of AI. AI is completely useless. The current vision on the current technologies of AI are not, there are exceptions like AlphaGo or alpha 0 that are not so much based on data, but most of AI is a combination of machine learning and big data. And the question is where that data comes from, who's compensated for that data, how you acquire that data. This intersects with privacy concerns, but lots of other things. And the proponents of the current direction of AI say privacy concerns are not so important and users are empowered to choose the privacy settings that they want. So I want to argue against that. And I'm going to base this on a paper by myself and several co-authors, Ali Makhdoumi, Azhar Malekian, and also Özdag. So imagine that you have a setting in which users have a privacy value, either intrinsically or in order to protect their consumer surplus from price discrimination, but also enjoy payments or free services on platforms. Normalize the value of data to the platform to 1, and normalize and denote the value of privacy for users by VI for user I. The key here is that data is social. When I share data, I'm not sharing necessarily just data about myself. I'm also sharing data about my demographic group, about my neighbors, about my friends, and so on. So to do that, you need to assume that what data signifies, the information data signifies, is correlated across users. So let's assume, I'm not going to go into the mathematical details, but if you want to visualize it, assume a normal distribution with a correlation coefficient between the information of users given by row. And let's take a very simple example, which I'm going to use to illustrate what you might call the privacy boondog. 2 users, one who's not very privacy conscious and is willing to share data for whatever reason. So V1 is less than 1, but the other one is very privacy conscious, V2. So since V1 is less than 1, if the second user did not exist, social planner would say, sure, of course, user 1 should share her data with the platform. And in fact, in any market where you can construct with explicit prices or with free services, the platform is going to capture that data even if the user is rational. But when there is the social nature of data, when user 1 shares her data, she's also going to reveal information about user 2. So to illustrate this, let me take the extreme form where rho is approximately 1. So you reveal a lot of information about user 2. So what that means is that there's a first order negative externality. You are violating the privacy of user 2. But it doesn't stop there. It's actually much worse than that, because what happens is that once user 1 shares her own data, she's revealing so much information about user 2 that user 2's information becomes not so valuable to protect. So even though user 2 would, in an ideal world, prefer not to share her data, after user 1 shares her data, she says, well, all of my privacy has been violated already, so she would also be willing to share her data. But once she starts sharing her data, that now enables the platform to acquire user 1's data for cheaper and cheaper. In fact, in this example, as rho goes to 1, the platform can capture both users' data for 0 price. And that would be despite the fact that V2 can be very large, or there may be lots of other negative social externalities from acquisition of data. In fact, you can easily show that even if both users don't want to share their data, there's a coordination problem between the two, and they might both end up sharing their data, again, creating a data monopoly in the hands of platforms. Now, this is not just bad for privacy reasons. This same sort of forces also imply that firms that acquire a lot more data will become more and more dominant in the product markets that they supply. So economists generally think that competition is the most effective way of controlling misbehavior by firms. But as you create more and more data monopolies, competition starts malfunctioning. Why? Because if one firm has a lot of data and has acquired a lot of data, that makes other firms much harder for it to compete against. And as a result, they are neither a good sort of protector against the monopoly of the data-rich firms, but even worse, in general, in such environments, this is another project, you can show that pricing decisions are strategic complements, which means that actually when one firm has a lot of data and can use that for price discrimination and charge higher prices, that will enable other firms to charge higher prices as well. So what you are seeing, therefore, is yet another dark side of the data. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to get up and turn on these lights again. These sensors are misbehaving. Sorry. Okay, well, we're running out of time, and I want to sort of talk about other things as well. But let me just say another aspect of this sort of AI's effects on industrial organization is what you might call behavioral manipulation. As firms know more and more, they might actually know more about the consumers than they themselves know. And that opens the way to a lot of different new forms of manipulations. But I want to link all of this to the effects of AI in the job market as well. So AI as a broad technological platform can be used for many things. It can be used for creating new tasks. Actually, we have some very great examples of that. It can be used for reorganizing work in a human-friendly manner, or it can be used for automation. And AI, there's been a lot of talk of AI, but if you try to measure AI, you see that there's very little of it before 2015 in the US, but there is a huge increase in AI, for example, as witnessed by vacancies for AI-specific skills in the US from 2015 onwards. So there's about a fourfold increase in those postings in the course of a few years. But which are the firms or establishments that actually drive this? Well, in recent work with Joe Hazel, David Otter, and Pasquale Restrepo, what I find is that this comes almost entirely from establishments that have a lot of tasks that can be automated by AI. And those are the fourth quartile and the third quartile, depending on different measures that we use. Felton et al.'s measure the suitability for machine learning, or based on Michael Webb's work, exploiting patent text. In all of these texts, in all of these cases, about half of the US establishments that don't have many tasks that can be automated don't post many AI things, but those at the fourth and the third quartiles do. And when you look at the data, and we do this much more detailed, much finer variation, but here is a summary. When you look at their hiring, then you see that exactly those that are introducing AI technology slow down their hiring. The other establishments continue to hire, and those ones essentially are flat. So overall, the evidence is that AI, even though it could be used in many different ways, it could be used for reinstatement or displacement, using the same terminology as I have used, you see that it's going much more in the automation direction. And this is not relevant just for developed economies. Right now, we're seeing it in developed economies, but I've also argued that AI is the quintessential inappropriate technology, meaning that it is a technological path. It's a particular direction of technology that is developed in the West, and as it spreads and shapes the global division of labor and is adopted in the developing world, it's very unsuited to the conditions in the developed world. Because the real strength or competitive advantage of emerging market economies is their semi-skilled and low-skilled workers, and AI is about the substitution of algorithms and very skilled engineers' work for those things. So it will be another force creating inequality. There are many other aspects of how AI is being used today, monitoring, and also the ad-based model, which I have worked on, but let me not sort of talk about those, since I want to conclude in 5 minutes, and I could just about do that, and leaving enough time for discussion at the end. So these were all sort of to say that in the area of AI, in the area of general production technologies, and in the area of energy, we have significantly different consequences from different directions of technology. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and the question is which ones we end up choosing. So for that, we need a theory of endogenous direction of technology, and which is what a lot of my work over the last 20 years has been focused on. So let me now summarize that in one slide or two slides. Imagine that we have two abstract objects, AG and AB, good technology and bad technology, clean energy versus fossil fuel, or excessive automation versus more balanced technology. And the key is what is feasible and what are the incentives. So what is feasible is summarized by the innovation possibilities frontier. Imagine that we can put some more resources, R&D research workers or research spending, SG, and that will give us more faster growth of AG, or we can put more of them in SP, and that will give us more of AB. What will determine how the market allocates these things? Well, three things. One is expectations about what is feasible. So that I'm going to capture by expected. So imagine this eta G here is not known. So it's the expectation of eta G and expectation of eta B. Government taxes and subsidies, tau G and tau B. And of course, what firms perceive as the pre-tax profits from the two technologies, pi G and pi B. So under some weak assumptions and some market structure for research, you can generate an equilibrium condition that says the equilibrium is going to be such that expected profits from putting more money in SG has to be balanced with the expected profits of putting more money in SP. So now you can see three sets of things that are going to influence this technology. How profitable is pi G versus pi B? What are the policy distortions and what are the belief distortions? There is no guarantee that the equilibrium is efficient, even absent any belief or policy distortion. Why? Because pi G and pi B are not necessarily proportional to social benefits. So, for example, if pi B is fossil fuels, more fossil fuel profits are associated with more climate damage. Or if pi B is using AI for ad manipulation, that's going to be very profitable for Facebook or Google, but it's not necessarily going to be in society's objectives. But in addition, we can also have subsidies making things better or worse. So for instance, fossil fuel industry today receives about $5 billion a year in terms of subsidies globally. And of course, there could be distortions in terms of beliefs. What researchers find is the more attractive area for pushing research forward. Well, now I want to quickly show you what redirection of technology could look like, starting from a baseline. And to do that, I want to focus on energy and point out that despite the fact that our history with energy technologies has been one of failures, especially failure to introduce carbon tax or other regulations, there have been actually reasonably striking advances in some renewable energies, solar and wind especially. So here is Irina's estimates of the cost of solar and other renewables. And wind was already not so much more expensive than fossil fuels in the 1980s, but solar energy was prohibitively expensive as late as 2010. But there has been a tremendous advance in both of these, and actually a few other renewable areas. How did this come about? Well, it was due to redirection of technological change. So if you look at what's going on is that during this period, you have a run-up in the number of renewable and green patents relative to either all patents or patents that use fossil fuel. And this is in the US up to about 2010, and that's what you're seeing after the 2010, the decline as a result of these innovation stock increasing. The same is true in Canada, France, and Germany, even more so than the US, as you would expect, since they were the ones that provided even more funding and some carbon tax. But from 2010, there is a reversal. Why is that? Well, actually, because from around 2010, natural gas becomes very cheap and starts killing the incentives for renewables. So here is one figure to sort of make that case. I'm showing you in blue now the same figure here, green versus fossil fuel patents in the car industry. And in the electric generation, and the dashed line here is the natural gas price index. So when alternative energy was attractive, renewable energy was attractive, people invested more, and then when natural gas started becoming cheaper, then you had complete reversal. So in terms of the framework, this really emphasizes this pi B versus pi G part. Of course, there is some tau B and tau G, but they're not huge right now. But they have, they have played some role, but not as much as pi G and pi B. What about in the area of automation and AI? Well, I want to argue and then I will conclude after this, that there are several factors that have made the general production technologies and AI, both of them go in the direction of excessive automation. Global competition for Western firms have forced them to cut labor costs, and many firms thought that the way to do that is actually automate. So in some sense, that has created a boost for Pi B. Even more important, and we can go into the details of this in Q&A, the business models and the growing size of big tech has been a huge factor in both through the expectations, vision, how to conceptualize new technologies, what they are about, and also profit incentives. Most of the big tech have a business model that works on the basis of algorithmic automation. And as they become bigger, that's like a boost for Pi B. We have also had changes in labor market institutions. As I said, labor market need not be competitive. And when it's not competitive, then another thing that determines the direction of technology is worker power. And worker power, of course, is not very good for automation. And as worker power gets diluted, that really acts as another boost for automation. And then finally, most Western countries, especially the US, subsidizes capital. So if you look at the US, the marginal tax, effective marginal tax on capital was always lower than the labor, which is taxed more heavily, but it's become for a variety of reasons. Again, we can go back into the Q&A, has essentially plummeted since 2000. Today, software and equipment capital used for automation are taxed at less than 5%. If you hire workers instead, that's taxed at 25% plus. So therefore, what I'm arguing is that the general direction of technology in all of these areas, fossil fuel, general production technologies towards automation, and AI, have all been biased in directions that are not necessarily socially efficient. For AI, these visions, what AI researchers are really excited about is really important as well, but let's leave that to the Q&A. But if you look at what AI researchers are motivated by, it turns out to be the wrong problem in some sense. It's a side effect of the Turing test type of reasoning that cool AI research should be reaching human parity, and it really distorts what type of AI research gets done, both in universities and in the context of the Silicon Valley and Cambridge and other AI hubs. All of this also gives us a lot of lessons about how redirection of technology could happen. In the area of renewables, you see what it took. There was some subsidies to energy, which of course required a new measurement framework to be developed. There was changes in social norms, awareness among consumers. Then there was price incentives coming from the natural fluctuations of gas and oil prices. But all of this was on a very ad hoc basis. There wasn't in the context of solid regulation or carbon taxes globally. And that's the weakness of the institutional context. And what really is missing in all of these is this sort of broader institutional context for redirection of technological change. So that has some political economy elements. That's why I said at the beginning, this is all about political economy as much as technology. But again, I'm going to leave that to the Q&A. I'm sure some of you will have questions on that. So let me now conclude. I have argued, at a high level that technology is much more malleable, its direction much more flexible than generally assumed. And this matters especially because different directions create different externalities, different productivity benefits, and different distributional consequences. And the market process doesn't generally get that right, too many externalities. And then I try to illustrate these in the context of energy, production technologies, and AI. I spent quite a bit of time in the area of production technologies, precisely because that's where you can see how the type of economic model one uses biases the way that one thinks. And I try to make that point by developing these task-based models, and also talked a little bit about how to redirect technological change. Let me now stop sharing the screen, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Daron. We still have 25 minutes for questions. I'm just going to turn first to the room here, whether anyone would like to raise a question. We have plenty of questions on the chat and Q&A as well. I'm just seeing whether a hand goes up, because if not, I think I will see whether, I think Jim Malkinson had a question. And so I'm not sure whether we can get Jim to.
Yeah, that would be great to hear Jim's voice.
Yes, indeed. So Jim,
can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
It was really more a comment, Darren, that this argument about factor prices impacting the direction of technological change is something that Bob Allen argued about in the Industrial Revolution as a big effect on what the technology was developed and where it was developed, particularly in the UK. It was just really that comment that it relates to the same point you're making, I think.
That's right. Thanks, Jim. Thanks for raising that. Yes. Well, actually, you know, that idea sort of appears in Marx. Then it's in Hicks, the theory of wages. I was going to make that comment since this is the Hicks lecture, but then as I was running out of time, I forgot that point. So it's actually a comment that I wanted to make, and it's relevant because this is the Hicks lecture. But it's also Hicks is the first person to make this comment that high wages would create a particular type of bias in technology, and that has two historical relevances. One is much less important, but it's my own history of thinking, because I started working on directed technological change in the 1990s, and then after I started working on it, I discovered Hicks, and I first tried to make sense of Hicks using the type of models that I was using at the time, and I couldn't, and I concluded Hicks was onto something good, but he wasn't using the right sort of economic forces, because at the time I was actually using directed technological change, but in more models that had this factor augmenting technology. But it turns out that Hicks's reasoning makes much more sense in this sort of task-based framework. And then sort of Hicks's idea, without reference to Hicks, is picked up by Habakkuk. So Habakkuk makes the argument that the reason why the United States pulled ahead of the the UK, in the second half of the 19th century was high wages that created another impetus to industrialization in the US. And then Bob Allen's subsequent work that develops a new theory of industrial revolution based on all of these ideas. And all of this actually fits very nicely into the framework, or a general version of the framework that I have I've sort of outlined, but I didn't have time to get into that. Thanks, Jim.
Okay. Can I just look in the room if there's any questions? Otherwise, we'll continue with some of the online questions. I think Jake Reagan has a question. You are muted. Yeah.
Hi, yes. I was wondering if you had any specific regulations or kind of incentive programs that we should be advocating for to have the creation of new tasks outpace the displacement effect.
Great question. Unfortunately, not completely direct ones, but I think there are many indirect ones that are important to consider. So the first one is that, as I've touched upon, one pillar, not the most important pillar, but one pillar of inefficient emphasis on automation comes from the tax system. So a tax reform that removes the asymmetries in the taxation of capital and labor, I think would be beneficial for other standard public finance reasons, but it would also have the additional benefit of removing this excessive impetus for automation. So essentially, if the numbers I presented to you are correct, which come from a paper I wrote with Andrea Manera and Pasquale Restrepo in the Brookings papers on economic activity, it implies that firms shave about 20% indirect costs by automating instead of using labor that has more or less the same cost as machinery. So how much of that is impactful for the marginal automation? There are different estimates for that, but it would be useful. But then there are other aspects of what you are doing with automation-like technologies that could be regulated. So one area, again, going a little bit beyond automation to the more broader use of data AI, is that when you look at where a lot of the profits from AI-like activities comes from, is a huge part of it comes from digital advertising. So if we think that digital advertising is, a very valuably, socially valuable activity, then perhaps that's okay, and we might want to worry about some of the other privacy issues in the collection of data that becomes the lifeblood of that sort of activity. But if you also think that digital advertising, both in the political domain and other areas, is actually also creates some negative effects as well as positive effects, then there would be a case for digital advertising tax. And that's been advocated recently by others as well. And that would be a huge will have huge implications in terms of how you use data, how much emphasis on automated processes that are very critical for this sorts of things. So there are a couple of other areas like that. But I think moving forward, there might be even more direct regulations that might be necessary. For example, encouraging firms to introduce more new tasks or labor-friendly technologies. And there are some precedents for that sort of things, but I think they require much greater research than we have available at the moment. Thank you.
Right. I think we have a question from Michael Wolfson on, I think, on the model in the first part of the talk. Yeah.
Yes,
hi, Michael.
Thank you. Hi. My question is whether you have any comments on the potential endogenous connection between jobs displaced and jobs created. The idea being that there might be a mechanism whereby the excess labor created by displaced jobs makes some new tasks feasible.
Absolutely. Wonderful question, Michael. So there are, in fact, two mechanisms at work here. And I think both of them are important. One of them is exactly what is modeled along the lines of what you're suggesting. And it's in the one of the first papers I wrote in this topic together with Pascual Restrepo, the paper in the American Economic Review in 2018. And there is a self-equilibrating mechanism, which is that if you automate too much, then you're shedding a lot of labor, and labor becomes comparatively cheaper at the margin, and it encourages the creation of new tasks with labor. The point to note is that that's an equilibrating mechanism, but it's not necessarily an efficient mechanism. So that mechanism will not necessarily take us to efficiency, but it will imply that there are some counterbalancing effects. The other mechanism, which would be very interesting to study, is that some of these automation technologies also restructure work. So they change the skill and other requirements of existing occupations, and that could be another channel to be analyzed. So in other words, automation itself then remakes the task composition of remaining occupations.
Right. Thank you. I think we have one more online, and then we'll have some in the room here as well. So I think Francis Stewart had a question or comment.
Mine was more of a comment, which was that another reason for excessive investment in AI might be that individually, the firms don't take into account the fact that collectively, they're going to depress wage costs.
Very good. Yes, absolutely. That's right. But I think the opposite may also be the case in the firms. Not opposite, but sometimes there is evidence that firms are actually sometimes strategically using automation in order to reduce the bargaining power of workers. So that's one of the issues that goes back to Marx's discussion of the self-acting mule, which is actually quite controversial because he may have gotten the facts wrong, but there's a debate on that. So Marx thought that the self-acting mule would make it impossible for workers to organize and have any bargaining power precisely because it was automating work. But then there have been some counter arguments to that. But in the present period, there are many issues related to automation and labor relations. And one reason why internationally things are different is that in some countries where union movements or worker movements are stronger, there's a lot of negotiations about automation. So in Germany, work councils that have a say on the board get involved in automation decisions, at least in some places. And one of the things that they try to ensure is that automation is not done in such a way that's going to completely undercut bargaining power. So I think those are really fascinating issues. Thanks very much, Francis.
Hamish, I think Hamish Lowe has a question.
So just following up a bit on the international dimension of this, in a way, if I think about the policies you're talking about to try to shift the way that automation works, or how technological change is happening, how's that going to play out in terms of competition across different countries in terms of their technological leadership?
Wonderful question. I don't know, but the same question is relevant, not just for automation, but also for energy. So, ever since, these issues started being talked about, say, in the late 2000s, and also in some of my work around that time on the direction of technology and energy, one question that was always up in the air and discussed is, you might invest in renewable technologies using carbon taxes in the US or in Europe, but that's going to then create room for China to export carbon-produced intermediates more cheaply. And I think that the picture is more complicated than that, because there are also international technology spillovers. So once a significant number of countries, especially technologically big countries, technologically determining countries like Germany, US, Canada, UK, invest in a particular or redirect technology in a particular direction, that might create reverberations on where China and India will go in terms of technology adoption and ultimately technology development. But that won't work in everything. So I think it would work in technology that's relevant for energy. It might work for production technologies. But in terms of AI, especially data collection, I think it's a much more complex picture, because if you think of important alternative directions of how you're going to deal with data and privacy, I think the two poles of that are, a lot of concentration of data in the hands of governments or corporations versus a lot of privacy protecting technology. So imagine on the one hand, you have encryption and Tor and other ways of ensuring greater say on how people's data is used. On the other hand, much bigger, better snooping, much better data collection technologies, including facial recognition, including data processing at large scale without individual consent. So I think it's very difficult to dislodge China from that one pole. So on that one, I think the global direction may be much more problematic. But for other things, including energy and general production technologies, there may be more complementarities between what one technology leader does and then how others might follow.
We have a question from Rachel Morrow-Nguyen.
Yes, hi. A couple of years ago, I read your book, Why Nations Fail. And prior to that, I was really convinced that technological innovation was probably a bad thing for inequality. But after reading the book, kind of convinced by the idea that states actually need to embrace this kind of innovation, even if without fear of the employment impacts that it might cause. And I remember well the example of kind of spinning wheels and the concern of weavers protesting and that kind of thing. So I'm wondering how that analysis fits in with this, and particularly obviously from a policy perspective, should states therefore be more involved in selecting innovation? And especially for developing countries like my own South Africa, where or others where maybe you don't have a skill set within government that would be able to select good technology necessarily well, where should state, but also have a massive concern for inequality and social evils and stuff, where should states be going?
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. That's a wonderful question. And you are indeed right that Why Nations Fail was more optimistic about technological change, ultimately bringing sort of benefits to especially developing economies or emerging economies. That book was written in 2010, so it's now 12 years. So some of my thinking has changed in the meantime. So I am not certainly advocating that technological change is bad, but my thinking is, I guess I would say perhaps a little bit more nuanced, that the direction of technology matters, and that is going to be something that the market by itself may not get completely right. That doesn't mean that the government will get it completely right. So let me try to say two more things that are specifically related to the issues that you raised. One is, spinning and weaving and such things as that happened in the early industrial revolution, and the second is picking winners. So indeed, your view of whether you should be optimistic or more pessimistic or guarded about the industrial revolution's technological implications will depend on what period you look at. So if you look at the period from around 1750 to 1830s or so, actually that you wouldn't be so optimistic about what technological change meant for the British workforce. So, 1840s was when Engels wrote the Conditions of the English Working Class. And he wasn't completely wrong that conditions had worsened a lot. People were working longer hours under much less sanitary conditions than before. But also, even though this was indeed the time of amazing technological progress, according to Bob Allen's estimates and other economic historians' estimates, there is no real wage increases for a period of about 7 or 8 decades. So, but then look at it by 1900 and things are looking much more optimistic. So why is that? Well, either that's because the market worked, it took some while, or actually, like I was arguing for the case of green technologies, you needed some institutional changes. And in fact, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, with the first Reform Act, Chartist movements, trade unions being recognized, and a variety of other institutional changes, did see quite a significant transformation in the fabric of British society. So I guess I would say we might be closer to that second interpretation, or at least I might be closer to that second interpretation today. But that doesn't mean picking winners either. I think when people talk of picking winners, the government is saying, well, this firm is better than the other firm. But it does mean some sort of government intervention in the economy. And in what way? Well, again, let's take the fossil fuel example. I don't think the economy is going to fix the fossil fuel problem by itself. So the government does need to regulate fossil fuel consumption, and it needs to put a very hefty carbon tax. And I think on top of it, it also needs to provide much more generous support for the development of green technologies, including in the energy grid and other options. So, but the question is, that's not classic industrial policy where you're picking firms, but you are trying to deal with some externalities. And I think that might be the right sort of framework for thinking about these issues.
We have Stephen Broadbury.
In today's rich countries, agriculture accounted for 60 to 70% of employment before the 19th century. It's down to 2 or 3% today with the automation of jobs. Workers found jobs in other sectors and shared in the productivity gains. So why has this not happened more recently with the automation in manufacturing?
It's a great question. Thank you very much for this question. So again, I don't know for sure. And my assessment, though, of course, you know the evidence better than I do, is that, there's a lot of heterogeneity. So automation is a process that, has happened over time in different countries, and different countries' experience is quite heterogeneous. So in the US, for example, the evidence that I have looked at suggests that there was indeed quite a lot of disruption. A lot of people lost their jobs. The labor share in agriculture is completely, cut into like 1/3 over this process. And as you say, in the medium run, however, things worked out. And how did they work out? Well, my interpretation is that they worked out because around the same time, the US economy generated a lot of new tasks and new technologies. Part of it was driven by new industries. Part of it was driven by complete reorganization of existing industries. So the factories, as together with electrification, also became very different places, much better organized. A lot of non-production workers, clerical workers, design, maintenance, sort of more skilled work entering into factories. And then also the non-manufacturing sector expanded. the numbers I have seen, they're sort of bits and pieces, but around the same time as the labor share is declining in agriculture, you have actually the labor share is increasing in the non-agricultural sector of the economy, which is a telltale sign that you're having not just more workers pushed into the non-industrial sector, but new jobs pulling workers, especially more skilled workers, into the non-agricultural sector. So that would be the sort of the model that I'm advocating for the digital automation as well. That right now what we have is digital automation automates work, and workers are pushed into lower skill jobs, and that's why you have this middle skill jobs disappearing and more workers going into lower skill occupations in the US, for example. But the pool is absent, which is that you're not generating the new tasks and new opportunities that will then pull some of these workers to the higher parts of the occupational distribution. Thank you for raising that issue.
I think we have time for one more, the final one, and I think it's David Vines.
Hi, thank you very much for what you've said. I'm thinking about the work that Dan Susskind has done, focusing on the creation of new products, movies, tourism, whatever, as leading to new tasks in the creation of these new products. And you partly talked about that and answered the last question, but does this thinking in the product space help you think about whether replacement is likely to keep up with or run ahead of displacement in the production space, in the task place?
That's a great question. And indeed, yes, I think new products are very important. But of course, if you at least you look at it from the lenses that I'm looking at the end of the day, it really boils down to tasks. So essentially the model that we use, for example, in the most comprehensive things is you have many sectors and then tasks within sectors. So the question is, do the new products that you're creating are going to generate more and more tasks that are relevant for labor? So if you create a lot of new tasks, but they're all automated, that's not going to help. And indeed, you're right that tourism and entertainment are two sectors where so far production is not very automated, and more sort of spending in those areas would be one of it. But I think those are still limited sectors. I think at the end of the day, you need some of the core sectors of the economy: manufacturing, retail, wholesale, transport. Those sectors also need to create meaningful new jobs, but obviously these new products in other domains will help as well. Thank you for raising that issue.
I think we're coming to the end of this session. I think it leaves me to thank you, Daron, for really stimulating talk. And we have many more questions that we had online. I'll probably forward them to you and you can have a look at them. Well, thank you very much. And let's thank Daron in the usual way from the room here.